If it's okay with you, what I'll do is I'll set the microphone down, and can everybody hear me if I'm just talking like this?
Yeah.
Because I always have difficulty navigating the microphone, because I talk a lot with my hands, so what I know happens with me, I'm talking with the microphone and then I move it away and I say something and people don't hear and that sort of thing. So if it's okay with you, I'll talk without the microphone. If for some reason I say something and you don't hear it, just wave your hand and I'll repeat. So what I'm going to chat a little bit about is I'm going to talk a little bit about reverse inclusion. And it's interesting, before I start getting into it, a couple of things that I would probably want to do to kind of lay some of the groundwork. First thing is, I know from discussions I've had in Canada and other countries, that it can be a really heated topic. And I think it can be heated at times because we're starting from the wrong point. And I think the point we want to start from is that everybody in the room would agree that we want people to play sports. So if we start with that understanding, then what we really have to do is we have to find the pathway that all of us can get on to get to that goal. Because I don't think we disagree on the goal. I think where we get distracted is the path to get to that. So what I'd like to do today, as we're going through discussions and some of the Q&A later, is start from that. We all agree we want people to play sports. Now we just got to figure out, how do we get as many people as possible playing sports? And one of the sports we have to choose from is wheelchair basketball. So that kind of starts us in agreement. Now we've got to figure out how we all get on the same path. So a couple other things before we get started. I'm just going to call it inclusion. I was talking with Sharon about this and James the other day and Bridie. And I'd rather call it inclusion than reverse inclusion, because I think inclusion is something we as a society all agree is good. And I think I'd like to start talking about it from a larger perspective, in that perspective. So I'm just going to, you'll see some of my slides say reverse inclusion, but really what I'm going to be talking about is just the concept of inclusion, something that we have in society overall. Second thing, interestingly, when Bridie asked me to chat about this, I started thinking back, and I actually presented, the first time I talked about inclusion was in 1993 at the Vista Conference. And so I actually went back and I looked at my notes from all the way back then. I just finished my playing career at that time. And I referenced that, and I saw a lot of the similar discussion, a lot of the similar arguments, points brought up, but I also see the way things have expanded. And that's where I really want to go today as I'm starting to talk about this, is think about how our understanding of inclusion has really grown, and it has. It's broader and it's more complex than it was back in 1993. But the arguments are still sound. The rationale for it is still there. And then I had a kind of a little aside here. So I was talking with my wife the other day. We were driving along in the car, and I was talking about the presentation and everything like this. And my wife was like, "That's great, you know, Frog." She calls me Frog as well, as opposed to Mike. Most people call me Frog. She goes, "This idea of inclusion, you know, I think it's great." She agrees wholeheartedly. I think it's awesome that anybody who wants to can get in a chair and play wheelchair basketball. It's a sport for everybody. She goes, "But I got a question. How far do you want to go with this idea of inclusion?" I said, "I think we want to be fully included in everything." She looked at me and goes, "So does that mean you're willing to give up your wheelchair accessible parking and let everybody have it?" And I said to her, "honey, small steps. Let's work on making sport inclusive worldwide before we go on to the really big topic of sharing my accessible parking space." So a little side note there as we get started. So first thing, I want to start with? I want to start with, the idea, it's more than a good idea. Okay? We often start with it just saying, oh, it's just a good idea. And I'll use my own experience as an example. In addition to coaching in our national program, our academy athletes with their senior programs, and our juniors programs coming up, I also do a junior wheelchair basketball program in our community. It's a program that we run on Monday nights. It's an hour-and-a-half long session. And the kids that are in it are between the ages of 8 and 14 years old. They're hopping in a chair for the first time and they're learning wheelchair basketball for the first time. But half the kids have disabilities, but half the kids are kids who are able-bodied. And when I look at that, I think, we've got kids playing sports. That's just a good idea. And it just happens to be that some of the kids have disabilities and some of the kids are able-bodied. All those kids, they just want to play the sport of wheelchair basketball. So I think it's a good idea if we have kids playing sport. That's just good. We all want that. So that's the first piece of this that we want to be aware of. I think it's just a good idea. We've also looked at playing a sport as a right. We all agree that access to programs is a right. In fact, I remember having a discussion with my stepsister, and it was about 2 years ago or so, and the United Nations had a resolution that sport for people with disabilities was a fundamental right, access to it, around the world. And a number of countries had signed on, and at that particular point in time, Canada had not signed on to it. My stepsister was a little bit upset at that. She thought there was a tremendous hypocrisy that we were supporting our Paralympic athletes, wanting to win medals, wanting to be successful, and yet we had not yet signed on to this agreement that sport, access to sport for all, in particular in this instance for people with disabilities, is a fundamental right. And we've since signed on. We signed on back in the fall. But we increasingly understand that access to sport is a right. And so if it's a right for people with disabilities, it's a right, obviously, for people who are able-bodied. And if we look at wheelchair basketball as a sport, it makes sense that it would be accessible for people who are able-bodied. They would be able to access the sport of wheelchair basketball. So we also see it as a right. Where I want to go is the next place. I see sport and access to it as a basic need. And I think sometimes we get distracted in this sense. We know there are certain basic needs we have. Everybody will agree that food is a basic need. Shelter is a basic need. Clothing is a basic need. It helps us survive. But we also increasingly understand there are other needs that we have for our personal well-being. And one of those needs is belonging. We know through research that belonging is something fundamental, that when people are isolated in our society, that affects our mental health, that affects our well-being. So when I look at inclusion, in whatever framework that is, I see it as something that leads to well-being. I see that as something that helps in our own health. And behind that belonging piece, there are two byproducts that come from it, that lead to that well-being. The first byproduct is when you are included, when you belong to a group, whether it's a family, whether it's a team, whether it's a country, you are seen for your value, what you bring to the group. And everybody wants to be valued. Everybody wants to have that larger purpose that comes from value. There's a second thing that comes from belonging. What happens is the group, as they interact, starts to understand the perspective of the people in that group. They start to be able to see through the other person's eyes because of shared experience. And I think that in today's society where we have increasing polarization, that's extremely important. That we encourage belonging and not segregation. So that we can not just value a person, but also see their perspective through shared experiences. And where we see that happen is if we have individuals who are able-bodied participating in wheelchair basketball, how does that impact the awareness of the public on a whole as to why we need to have a physically accessible university or hotels, resorts? We start to see why we need to have their physical accessibility components. More importantly, what we start to have is attitudinal accessibility. And that's the one that we often miss. So I think when we talk about inclusion, I think one of the most important reasons why we have inclusion is for that reason of belonging. We'll talk about that more as we go through this. So what I want to do now is I want to take a step back, because if we're going to understand our discussion now, I think we have to understand some of the history behind how we got to this point. Because that helps us understand what the problem is, or where we maybe lost our way sometimes. So, oops. There we go. So when we look back at wheelchair basketball, and I'll use wheelchair basketball as an example, but we can apply this in a lot of other areas. When we look back at wheelchair basketball, we remember that it was started after World War II, post-World War II. We had veterans that were injured and were now living because of medical advancements, where in the past they just simply died. That's probably the harsh reality, but they just simply died. And now they were living because of medical advancements. Places like Stoke Mandeville in Great Britain and in some of the naval hospitals in the United States, they started playing wheelchair basketball, and they started playing it as a component of their rehab. Well, that makes a lot of sense. It was tremendously valuable. We've all heard the stories of how it impacted those vets and how it shaped where we are now. But it was rehab. And rehab is for people who need rehab. If you're a vet with a spinal cord injury, it makes sense. You fit that mold. You fit that need. You need rehab. So it makes sense why you would only have that group there. If you're able-bodied walking around right now and it's a sports for rehab, you don't need rehab. Why are you playing? So that's where we started, and that makes a lot of sense. But now what happened is other types of disabilities, or people with disabilities, wanted to also play the sport of wheelchair basketball. In the 50s in the United States, there was a polio epidemic. People with polio couldn't play standard basketball, but they had this other sport that was emerging that they could play. So they wanted to play it, so they began to fold people with polio in and other types of disabilities. They said, well, yeah, this makes sense. Your spinal cord injury, a polio, there's some similarities. Yeah, we'll include that group. We'll include that group. And then in the 60s and 70s, there were individuals with amputations. They wanted to be included. And at each point in the discussion, there was a discussion, oh, well, it was really started for people with spinal cord injuries. Are we going to take away an opportunity from those individuals when we add in an individual with polio, when we add in an amputee? And they began to have those discussions about, is this going to take away opportunity? And they included individuals with polio. We know that because they're playing. They included individuals with amputations. They found ways of modifying the game or the structure of the game so that those individuals could be included. Then we started to see the addition of individuals with minimum disabilities. What we said was, well, you know what, they can't play stand-up basketball. So let's find a way to include them. And so we began to include a point system that addressed that. So we looked at ways that we could expand opportunities for other groups. What happened in the process, as we started to move through the 70s, 80s, and the 90s, was it changed from being a tool of rehab to being a sport. We began to look at individuals who were playing as athletes, not as patients. So now, we're looking at wheelchair basketball as a sport and not as a clinical tool. That changes who has access to it. Remember, if it's a clinical tool, if it's for rehab, it's for people who need rehab. If it's a sport, it's for people who need sport. And we saw a huge growth in the 90s and the first part of the 2000s as people who were competing in sports, like the Paralympics, began to get recognized as athletes. And there was a conscious effort on the part of the media and the athletes in the Paralympics to move the discussion from inspiration and my disability to look at my athleticism. Look at me as somebody playing a sport. So we began to see that evolution. Remember where we started. It was rehab. But it's no longer just rehab. In fact, its larger role is as a sport. So we started to see them as athletes, not as patients. Everybody can be an athlete. Not everybody meets the criteria for being a patient. And athletes play sports, and we make sport available to everybody. So part of where our difficulty, I think, lies is that we are still stuck sometimes thinking it is a tool of rehab. And it still performs that function, but to a much smaller degree. Its larger role, wheelchair basketball's larger role, is as a sport. And sport, we know, is for everybody. So I want to talk a little bit about a couple of the arguments for and against. And I'm not going to go through all of them because we can break them down into all these little splinter arguments. I'm just going to touch on a couple. Because we want to kind of know where some of this goes as we begin to discuss how do we get everybody on that same path we talked about at the beginning. So we know we want everybody to play sport. And we want to be included in society, so